Forever and a Day. Chapter 3. Roy Mitchell. She stood outside of the police station, fuming with anger. Her jaw was clenched, her fists were balled. To say that she was desperate would be an understatement, but the police were of no use to her. She'd spent more than a year trying to get their attention, and they shrugged her off, as though she were a lunatic for wanting to find her sister. She wasn't going to cry. She was beyond crying, though she had never really had much use for tears in the first place. She was a woman of action, never one to wallow in self-pity. The problem was, she didn't know what action to take anymore. All she could think to do in that moment was stand on the sidewalk, looking at the city around her, as though the answer to her problems would somehow appear out of thin air. Unfortunately, she wasn't so lucky. Fate rarely made things so simple for her. 1 week earlier, the entire East Coast had been buzzing with news about the missing boy. His face was all over the newspapers. Radio newscasters couldn't go a single hour without saying that boy's name, and each time she heard it, she wanted to scream. It shouldn't have been as hard as this. She shouldn't have to fight an uphill battle every single day just to get someone to notice her missing sister. But according to the police, grown women have the right to disappear. Without any sign of struggle, there was no crime. They didn't know her, and yet they could sit behind their desks and ramble on about what Leah would and would not do. They didn't know anything. She knew that her sister hadn't gone willingly. She knew that she was out there somewhere, still alive. She would have given anything in the world to trade places with her sister. It would have been so much easier than waiting and wondering. Her heart was pounding in her chest. Her mind was racing at 100 miles an hour. She was tired of waiting. She was tired of feeling so helpless. She turned and began to walk up the sidewalk, still not certain where she was going or what she was going to do once she got there. She simply needed to move. As she walked, she kept her eyes straight ahead and narrowed. Those who saw her stepped aside, because they could tell that she would be making way for nobody. It must have been a mile later that she finally allowed herself to stop. She walked into a small cafe and stood in front of the counter, not quite sure whether she was going to order a cup of coffee or burn the place to the ground. "Can I get you something?" asked the man behind the counter. He wore a white hat and an apron, and had a look about him, so genuinely pleased to be there. She was in no mood to deal with happy people. The world was an endless river of torment, and she often felt as though she were the only one struggling to stay afloat. She looked at the man, who was waiting patiently for her to order a cup of coffee or a piece of pie, and she still didn't know what she wanted to do. "Take your time," the man told her with a smile on his face. "I prefer the raspberry cream, but that's just me. Ask me tomorrow, and I'll tell you something else entirely." "No," she shot back, a little more harshly than she intended. She softened her voice and continued, "Just a coffee. Regular." "I think I can do that," he replied, grabbing a cup and beginning to pour. As she waited for her cup of coffee, she looked around the cafe. She was the only customer in the place, which wasn't surprising considering how run down and dirty it looked. Even the newspapers that were set out for customers to read were days old. "And for that, I'll take a dime," the man behind the counter told her, sliding a cup of coffee in her direction. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a dime. After taking her coffee, she walked to a nearby table and took a sip. The coffee was burnt. The cream tasted sour. She put that cup of coffee down on the table in front of her, with no intention of picking it back up again. As she did that, she noticed a newspaper sitting on the table next to her. It was a mess, having been read through and left in a pile by someone who didn't think it necessary to clean up after himself. The headline read, "Teddy Dowling Saved by Local Mystic." She stared at that headline for what seemed like an eternity, as her mind began to piece together a plan. She'd heard the story before in passing. People had been talking about it for a week, but she hadn't listened much to their stories because she didn't want to hear all about the boy who was saved, not while her own missing person had gone a year being ignored. Now it was starting to make sense. The boy hadn't just been found by the police. He was found by a psychic who the police had worked with. She reached over to that table and pulled the newspaper over to her own. She read through the story, taking in each detail of the boy's story, and finally locking her eyes on the name of the man who had helped to bring that boy home safely. Joe Oster, former mailman, owner of a bookstore, psychic. When she left the cafe, she carried the newspaper in her hand. She knew where she had to go and what she had to do. She needed to find Joe Oster and convince him to help her find her sister. A week had passed since the newspaper first wrote about Joe and his supposed psychic abilities. At first, he laughed at the story. It was wrong. He wasn't a psychic. He couldn't read minds or see the future. He could feel what other people felt, but that was hardly the same thing, and the rest of what he did was pattern recognition, or good guesswork. He wasn't psychic. He hated that word, because he didn't believe in predicting the future. The future hadn't been written yet, and if someone could see what was going to happen, the knowledge alone would change the outcome. He never wanted any of this to become public knowledge. He kept his skill to himself because he didn't want to be seen as some sort of carnival act or a false idol looking to be worshipped. When Joe was a little boy, he remembered seeing pregnant women coming to visit his mother. He didn't know why they were there or what was being said as the women whispered back and forth until he got a little older and a little more bold in his attempts to gain answers. At 13 years old, Joe held his ear to a door and listened to those hushed conversations. He heard a pregnant woman ask his mother whether she was going to be having a boy or a girl, and he heard his mother respond with certainty that it would be a boy. Was that a psychic ability? Was his mother looking into the future and seeing what the outcome would be, or was she just seeing what was right in front of her? If it was a psychic ability, it didn't seem like the sort of fortune-telling that would make a big difference in the world. Knowing whether someone was going to have a boy or a girl hardly seemed like the sort of thing that would end wars or cure infantile paralysis. All they would gain from that knowledge was the ability to knit a blue blanket instead of a pink one. She never seemed surprised by Joe's ability to feel what other people felt. She knew that it took a toll on him, but she didn't know what to do about it. She couldn't make him feel better when the world was falling apart. All she could do was try to comfort him. And then there was Norma, the girl who brought the purest, strongest emotion out of him. He thought that being around her could drown out the rest of the world, but that only lasted for so long. By the time the world found its way back into his soul once again, he was living in the city, surrounded by misery. He loved her all the same, but he couldn't expect her to take away the pain for the rest of his life. Maggie, on the other hand, was a light in the darkness, a beacon of hope in a sea of despair. If he could have kept that little girl in his pocket all day, he would have been a happy man. But that wasn't possible. When she got tired or restless, his connection to her weakened and the world came crashing down around him harder than ever. That day, after he saw the newspaper headline and he tried his best to avoid being noticed in the streets, his mind kept going back and forth between his mother and his daughter. He kept wondering if Maggie would have been like them, if she'd had the chance to live. Would she have felt the world the way he felt it? Would she have been able to tell whether a child would be a boy or a girl, healthy or sick? Psychic. That's what they were calling the man who always seemed to have more questions than answers. He would have found it funny if it wasn't so sad. He stayed in his shop from morning until night, for days after the newspaper article was printed. People would come to his shop and praise him or ask him questions, and he didn't know what to say to them. He wasn't a hero. In his eyes, he had killed his own family, whether he was behind the wheel of that car or not. He smiled when they praised him and thanked them for their kind words. It seemed so hollow, like such an act that he was putting on for their benefit. He just wanted them to go away. On a couple of occasions, people came into his shop and began reading the Bible to him, calling him evil and demanding that he repent for his sins. He told those people that he prayed for forgiveness every day, and he quoted his favorite passages back to them. One time he did this, the man who was yelling at him began throwing things at him and calling him the devil. Another time he wound up having a nice long conversation with a woman who had come in calling him evil and left with a tear in her eye. Whether he liked it or not, he had become a second-rate celebrity in that city. People stood outside his shop staring in at him through the front window as though he was a circus animal inside of a cage. Part of him wanted to retreat into that back room, turn off the light, and wait for the storm to pass. Another part of him wanted to figure out who had told the newspaper about him and strangle that person. Michael O'Shea had come into the bookstore on the day that the story first broke, hat in hand, and swearing up and down that he hadn't said a word to anyone. Joe believed him. Michael wasn't a liar, and he wasn't the type of man who would talk about someone behind their back. Not one line in that article included a quote from Michael, which would have been the norm if the reporter had interviewed the lead detective on a case. In the end, it didn't matter who had told the reporter about him. The story was out, and even if it was filled with lies about him, there was nothing he could do to put the cork back in that bottle. All he could do was wait for this news to pass and for the next big story to break. Perhaps the hardest part of this for Joe was when someone came into his store genuinely in need of help. When a parent came to him, begging him to help them find their missing child. Or even when a child came to him, begging for help in finding their missing dog. That part of the situation wasn't about Joe and his suffering. It was about that story giving people hope where none existed. The most memorable of these people came to Joe on a Tuesday morning. She must have been waiting in front of his store all night because she caught him just as he was leaving to get cleaned up. As soon as Joe walked out of his store, she stood from her seat on the sidewalk and looked him in the eye. At first, he thought that she was a homeless woman about to ask him for money. Her clothes were worn and full of holes. Her hair was a mess. She had bags under her eyes. If he'd only caught a quick glimpse of her, Joe would have thought that she was an old woman. But as he looked more closely, he saw past the wear and realized that she couldn't have been more than 40 years old. Even before she spoke, the woman began to cry. Joe could feel a knot forming in his stomach. She was nervous. She was scared, but not of him. She was scared because she also had just a little bit of hope, which could be torn apart at any moment. It was early in the morning. He wasn't fully awake, and so those emotions drilled into him. He found himself tearing up along with her, even before the woman had a chance to speak to him. When she began to talk, her voice was weak. Her lips struggled for a moment, trying to figure out how to make the sounds that she would need to convey her questions. Finally, she managed to ask him, "Can you help me?" He wanted the pain to go away. He wanted to look that woman in the eyes and tell her that he would help her if it was the last thing he did. He didn't even know what she needed help with, but it didn't matter. Either way, he knew that he couldn't help her. That pain just added to the emotions that he was already feeling. He couldn't bring himself to reject her plea for help and kick her to the curb. Instead, Joe opened the door to the store and allowed the woman to go inside. Once they were in the store, Joe hurried to grab the stool that he kept behind the counter and set it down where she could sit. She mouthed a thank you, but no sound came out. Before she could speak again, she was crying uncontrollably. Joe was leaning against the counter, holding his face in one hand, trying to hide the fact that he was crying with her, but she had to have known. They remained silent for several minutes, she too scared to ask for his help once again, him too scared to tell her that he couldn't. When he managed to raise his eyes and look at the woman, he saw that she was already staring at him. That hint of hope in her blew out like a candle. She already knew what he was going to say. He stepped closer to the woman and put his hands on her shoulders. He looked her squarely in the eyes, and all of her emotions seemed to amplify within her. Her mouth curled into a frown, so full of pain that he could barely stand to look at her. But he had no choice. What could he give her, if not help? Finally, he realized what he had to offer was his experience. "You will live," he told her, but he didn't attempt to make this sound like a good thing. "Every day you will see their face. You will hear their voice. You will look over your shoulder hoping to see them come up the street behind you, and each time you do, your heart will break all over again. I'm not a psychic. I can't help you find closure." As he spoke, Joe could feel the pain of 1,000 knives stabbing into his heart. He couldn't hold back the tears, but the woman in front of him wasn't crying anymore. Everything he was feeling, she still felt, but somehow less than before. Now she was looking at Joe with sympathy. "I'm sorry," he told her. "I'm so sorry." Most of the people who came to see Joe with requests for help were less than understanding when he turned them down. He never knew why this woman had come to him for help, because she had never had the opportunity to ask him. After he told her how sorry he was, the woman stood from the stool and kissed Joe on the forehead. She brushed his messy hair away from his face and gave him a knowing look and a slight nod of acceptance. She then turned and walked out of the store. He never saw her again. Once the woman was gone, Joe lowered himself onto the floor in front of the counter and sobbed uncontrollably for an hour. Everything that he had felt when he lost his own family had hit him at full force, and combined with what that woman brought into his store, it weakened him and made it impossible for him to hold those emotions back. So he sat there, weeping like a child. Every person that came to him for help brought their pain with them. Every time he turned them away, their pain twisted into anger. Whatever amount of healing they had managed to accomplish before going to see Joe was destroyed, and their loss was once again raw. He could hold those feelings down most of the time. He could dilute them with his own, to which he had built up a certain tolerance over the years. But those feelings weren't entirely blocked from entering him. Even if he only felt a fraction of what those people were going through, Joe was worn down. After a week, he was tired and just wanted life to go back to normal. Mary had been watching the door at the Capitol each day, waiting for Joe to walk into the bar. She had seen him only once since the newspaper article was published, and he looked horrible. She knew that it was her fault. That day when Teddy Dowling was rescued, she had eaten lunch with an interesting stranger, and she allowed herself to say things which she shouldn't have said. She didn't know that she was speaking on the record until the next morning when she saw the headline and the reporter's name under it, Roy Mitchell. For years, Joe's closest friends and family members had kept the knowledge of his skills to themselves because telling people would make him look like some sort of carnival act. He struggled to keep those skills under control, and his friends respected that struggle. That is, until they wanted to impress a stranger. Mary could have shot herself. She could have shot Roy, and she had every intention of doing so if she ever saw him again. But in that moment, all she cared about was Joe. She hadn't told him that it was her fault. How could she look him in the eye and tell him that she was the person responsible for putting his name on the front page of the newspaper? He would have hated her, and she wouldn't have blamed him, so she decided to wait until he had moved past the worst of this storm and tell him once he was back to normal. Her shift had ended an hour earlier. Now she was sitting at the bar staring at the door, waiting. The bar was busy that night. When the article came out, people started to talk. "I know Joe. Me too. Yeah, I heard he likes to wet his whistle down at that old hole in the wall. Let's go have our fortune told." Mary could hear the conversation playing out in her head. When she looked around the bar, she could see those people laughing, and she was certain that they were laughing at Joe. She felt horrible. Joe hadn't shown up in days. She wished that those people would just go away because she hated to think about what the place would look like if Joe did come walking through the door. Vasya was at the piano as one of the male customers that night played. She was singing "My Heart Belongs to Daddy," batting her eyelashes and waving her hands around just like one of those girls in the movies. Mary thought it was strange to see Vasya singing such a normal song when she normally preferred the slower, sadder melodies. The crowd seemed to be enjoying the song, never picking up on the subtle ways in which Vasya was mocking them for it, the exaggerated winks, the grand gestures. When she was done singing, the crowd cheered. The men whistled. The women put their hands to their chest and laughed, as though finding the whole thing terribly clever. Vasya walked over to where Mary was sitting and sat down to take a short rest. She looked to Mary and said, "If you're going to come in here anyway and you're not going to drink anything, you might as well pick up a tray." "I'm waiting for Joe," Mary told her. "Everyone is," Vasya nodded, lighting a cigarette. "Honestly, I think I prefer the depressing ones to the mocking ones. I was hoping that it was all in my head." Vasya smiled. "And we just suddenly had a boom in our business for no reason at all. A girl can pretend, can't she?" Vasya raised an eyebrow and rolled her eyes as she took a drag of her cigarette. She didn't need to say anything for Mary to know what she was thinking. Vasya was fond of pointing out the difference between hope and willful ignorance, and in this situation, Mary couldn't blame her. "The boy who was playing the piano has a friend that's been staring at the bar all night," Vasya told her, changing the subject. "Why?" Mary replied, still staring at the door. "Because there is a pretty girl sitting at the bar and he doesn't have the nerve to walk over to her." Mary looked around the bar for the girl that Vasya was talking about, but she saw no such girl. The closest thing she saw to a pretty girl was a middle-aged woman who was passed out with a cigarette in her mouth and a glass in her hand. "Did she leave?" Mary asked Vasya, turning back to the entrance. "She didn't leave, but she's not all here either." Mary turned to Vasya with a puzzled expression, eventually realizing that Vasya was talking about her. She then shook her head and said, "I'm done with men." "This one wears a uniform," Vasya smiled. "I don't care if he wears a suit made out of dollar bills. I'm not interested." "Since when?" "Since the last man I was interested in," Mary started before realizing what she was about to say and stopping herself mid-sentence. Vasya grew concerned. She put down her cigarette and asked, "He what?" "He lied to me, that's what," Mary told her, "and I'm done being lied to." Vasya smiled. "Then you really are done with men." Mary didn't respond. She turned toward the door and wondered if Joe was ever going to walk into the bar again. "I don't think he's coming tonight," Vasya told her. "He comes for the people. When the people start coming for him, I think he'll stay away." She was right. Mary knew that Joe wasn't going to show up. He would lock himself in the bookstore, away from everyone. Her mistake had cost him the world. He looked at his watch and began counting down the seconds until closing. Joe had had enough of the people coming into the store, pretending to browse at books while sneaking glances at him. It was as though they expected him to perform an entire magic act for them, and each time he looked up and caught someone staring, they looked away and gasped as though he had peered into their soul with his psychic ability. It would have been funny if they actually bought anything. Since they were just there to take up space and stare at him, it was more annoying than anything else. He was counting the day's earnings as those last seconds ticked away. It never took him very long to figure out how much he'd earned, but it gave him something to do after a long day of sitting on a stool and flipping through comic books. It was almost time. He could practically hear the cot in the back room calling to him. Once he turned off the lights and locked the door, he would be free from all of those peering eyes. He could listen to the radio and pretend that the rest of the world didn't exist. It was almost time. He opened the drawer beneath the cash register and grabbed the key to the front door. Just as he did this, he heard the bell above the door ring. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. If looks could kill, he probably would have murdered the woman that he saw when he looked toward the door. He tried to force a smile, but wasn't sure that it was working. The woman was well dressed, not the normal type of customer that he saw walk into his small store. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled beneath a green hat, which had a yellow bow tied around it. Her outfit was cut from the same fabric as the hat. It looked expensive. Joe couldn't help but take a nice long look at her as she walked into the bookstore and looked around the place as though she'd never seen anything like it in her life. Her eyes were deep blue, with a calm and collected appearance to them, but they could not hide the truth from Joe. She was putting on an act for him, presenting herself as perfectly put together, when the truth was that she was nervous and desperate. Joe didn't know what she was doing in his store, but he could tell that she wasn't there for a book. She was the same as all of the others who had come before her, though presented in a much nicer package. "We're closing," he told her. "Oui?" she asked, looking around the store. "That would seem to imply that there's more than one of you." "It's a figure of speech." She began to walk toward him, still taking in the view. He noticed that she was avoiding touching anything in the store, as though she might catch something if she did. "Since there is only one of you, am I correct in assuming that you are free to close whenever you wish?" "You are," he said. "And I do, so if you don't mind. I won't take up much of your time, Mr. Oster. If you'll just hear me out, I think you'll be interested to learn what I have to say." Joe thought it was funny how the well-off always thought that their problems were more interesting than all the other problems in the world. He couldn't help but smirk at how different she believed herself to be, while coming to him for the same reason as everyone else. "You find something amusing." "I didn't say that." "You laughed." It was more of a smirk. Now she smirked and took another look at the store around him before asking, "Do you really think you can afford to laugh at your customers, Mr. Oster? These are difficult times we live in." Growing more difficult by the second. In truth, he did not normally speak to his customers in such a tone. Joe was normally a very respectful man, even quiet at times. He was raised to say please and thank you. However, as soon as that woman walked into the store, he was struck by a sudden feeling of entitlement. In his annoyance, he had neglected to repress that feeling. "My sister has gone missing, Mr. Oster. A year as of the 7th, she told him. May 7th. The mention of that date sent a chill up his spine. It was the day his wife and daughter were killed 2 years earlier. The woman lifted her head as he reacted to that date. She noticed his reaction. He wished she hadn't. "Does that date mean something to you?" she asked him. He shook his head. She didn't seem to buy his response. "I understand that you've probably received a lot of requests since that article came out, and you seem like the type of man who has rejected all of those requests. Mother always said that modesty was a virtue. I meant that you're still poor. The cot I sleep on is the deluxe model." The woman opened her purse and pulled out a picture. The woman in the picture was nearly identical to the woman who stood before him. "They say that twins share a certain bond, that we can feel each other even when we're miles apart," she told him, placing the photograph on the counter in front of him and looking down at it. Joe's heart tightened. He could feel sadness and anger beginning to bubble inside of him, but he pushed it aside, never letting on. "Some call it a psychic connection," the woman finished. She looked at him as though she expected him to react to the word. He did not allow his expression to change at all as he waited for her to continue. She told him, "I don't believe I'm psychic." Anger, desperation, pain, loss, and yes, more of that sense of entitlement. "Neither do I," he replied. She ignored what he said and continued, "But I do believe that she's out there. No matter how many people tell me to give up on her, I just can't." She was holding something back. As soon as he felt that, he pushed the photograph toward her and said, "Sorry, I can't help you." The woman straightened up and gathered all of her high-end charm before saying, "Nobody wants to live this life, Mr. Oster. Why do you keep saying my name? Nobody wants to be sitting in an empty bookstore for the rest of their lives. The way business is going, I'll be lucky if I'm sitting here for the rest of the month." She slammed her hand down on the counter and screamed, "Stop it!" As soon as she shouted those words, the woman stepped back and tried to gather herself once again. He could tell that she regretted the outburst. "Look," he said to her in as firm a voice as she had been speaking to him. "I understand that a woman of your class, with the money to look the way you look and talk the way you talk, normally gets what they want. But I'm not your butler. I'm not your driver, and I'm certainly not your husband. I'd advise you to show a little more respect when you go begging people for help." She laughed. It was a sarcastic laugh, but a laugh nonetheless. "I don't beg," she told him. "I'm offering to pay you a rather large sum of money for your services. I'm not one of those either." She opened her purse and pulled out a card. As she handed it to him, she said, "I can see that you're not willing to listen to me right now. Here's my information. If you change your mind, please let me know. I wouldn't wait by the phone if I were you." She didn't respond at first. She simply nodded her head and started to walk toward the door. However, as she placed her hand on the doorknob and prepared to walk out of the store, she stopped for a moment. She silently contemplated what she wanted to say to him before turning. "I'm not a person who gets turned down very often, Mr. Oster. I don't imagine you are. Needless to say, I don't take it very well when I do. However, I hope that you will consider my offer, because I think you know as well as I do how hard it is to lose someone that you love. I can see it in your eyes, and I know that if you were in my position, if the person you lost were still alive, you would want someone to help you find them. And I also know that you wouldn't want to be mocked for your trouble." With that, she opened the door and stepped out of the store. She walked down the sidewalk past his store window without ever looking back at him. She'd said all that she needed to say. As she walked away from his store, Joe's sense of entitlement left with her. He was no longer feeling annoyed, desperate, or angry. However, the pain and loss lingered inside of him, feeding on his own emotions. There was something about the discussion that he had with the woman which he couldn't easily shake. She didn't seem like just another person who wanted help with her problem, as all of the others had been. Though he didn't like her, and he had no desire to speak with her again, that conversation seemed somehow important to him. He just couldn't explain why. Moments after the woman left his store, Joe walked to the door and locked it behind her. he turned off the lights and walked to the back room. Rather than turn on the radio, Joe sat in his wooden desk chair and found his mind drifting back to that conversation. Over and over again, he heard it in his head. He could sense the faint echoes of the emotions that she had brought into his store, just as he could recall the scent of her perfume. The very thought of contacting her seemed like a joke. He couldn't help her. Odds were if he did try to find her missing sister, he would end up getting all parties involved killed. He didn't have training. He didn't know how to fight or shoot a gun. He could piece together clues here and there, but any random person off the street could do that. He found himself humoring the thought, but each time he ran through the idea, he wound up with the same picture in his head, and it was a bloody picture at that. After shaking off the idea completely, Joe opened the top drawer of his desk. He pushed aside papers and receipts until he finally found what he was looking for. Each night he pulled that photo out of the drawer, and each night he buried it again. He told himself that it would someday get easier to look at their faces without feeling like he had a knife in his chest. On that particular night, he ran through a scenario in which he had decided to stay home on the night of May 7th. In his mind, it was a simple, quiet night with his family. After Maggie went to bed, he and Norma settled on the sofa. She rested her head on his shoulder, and they listened to soft music play on the radio. Maggie would have come out of her bedroom feeling sick. Her stomach would hurt, or her throat would be sore. Norma would bundle her up and keep her safe and warm at home while Joe went out to the drugstore for medicine. That night, he made it home. Some nights, he was the one who got hit by the car, and the next night, it would start all over again, maybe with a different scenario, but always with the same ending. They lived, just as they should have lived in the first place. Once Joe was through with his nightly ritual, he buried their picture in the drawer and closed it. May 7th. He couldn't help but wonder what it meant. What connection could there be between his own loss and that of the woman's sister? They had occurred a year apart, so they couldn't be directly related. In all likelihood, there was no connection. It was probably just a coincidence. Except, he didn't believe in coincidence. He believed in signs. He believed in pieces of a larger picture. He stood from his chair and walked into the dark bookstore, making his way to the counter without turning on the light. On the counter, he found the card that the woman left, along with the photograph of her missing sister. He stared at the missing woman's eyes, hoping to draw some clue from them, but it was just a picture. There was no emotion behind those eyes. He turned his attention to the card that the woman left for him. On it, her name was printed in delicate lettering, Annalise Meyer. Beneath her name was a telephone number, which he had no intention of calling, but which he found himself studying just in case the numbers provided him with some piece of information. He felt crazy for looking so closely into a random number that had been given to the woman by the telephone company, and he threw the card into the garbage can, putting it behind him once and for all. After the card was out of his way, Joe picked up the picture of the missing woman. He was going to throw it away too, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. He couldn't throw it away as though it were garbage, when that picture could have been the only thing left of a woman's entire life. It was a black and white moment in time, frozen forever. He couldn't see who else was in the room with her when she had that photo taken. He couldn't tell if her smile was genuine or an act. He couldn't even tell what color her dress was. The picture told him surprisingly little about that captured moment, but it did tell him that the woman existed. She was real, and she had lived a life. In the absence of emotion coming from that picture, Joe began to project them. He imagined her laughing and crying, screaming in anger and swooning with love. The thing that he'd come to learn over the years was that people were remarkably the same. They all felt the same things, only at different times. Without ever having met her, he knew that much about her. And the night she disappeared, May 7th. Mary was standing outside of the bookstore before the sun came up the next morning. She wanted to catch Joe before the store opened and more people came to test his psychic abilities. Even as she arrived, she wasn't sure what she was going to say to him. She didn't know if he'd guess that it was her who spilled the beans, or if she would have to break that to him. She didn't know if he would hate her or refuse to speak to her entirely. She would have preferred to run into him at the Capitol. At least then they would be in a crowded place with friends. It wouldn't have just been the two of them surrounded by silence. As she paced back and forth in front of the store, Mary stared down at her shoes, running through the conversation over and over again, trying to figure out the best way to talk to him. She didn't know whether she should start with the apology or work her way up to it. She didn't know if she should take off her heels in case she needed to run, or just let him give her a good punch in the eye. The sun rose, and Joe still hadn't come out of the bookstore. Mary looked at her watch and then put her face to the window, looking to see if he was in the back room, but she couldn't see that far into the building. She had a key to the store, of course, but she left that key at home so that she would know where it was in case there was an emergency. She turned and looked down the street. If she left right then, she could get back to her apartment, get the key, and return to the store in 15 or 20 minutes. But Joe could leave the store by then, and then she would be left waiting once again, unless she wanted to make the trip all the way to his apartment. Decision-making was never a strong suit for Mary. She could never seem to make up her mind when all of the options could turn out so badly. Finally, she decided to wait. She didn't need to be at work until noon, and Joe had to show up sometime. As she stood there, looking through the bookstore window, her focus shifted to the reflection on the glass. She saw a man crossing the street behind her, walking her way. His face was blurry at first, but she soon realized that it was Roy. The man who had twisted her words and written the article was coming straight toward her. She didn't turn around. She hoped that if she just pretended not to see him there, he would go away. Unfortunately, she was wrong. Before she knew it, Roy was standing beside her, looking at her reflection in the glass, smiling at her just as he had that day outside of the deli. She did not smile back. In fact, she turned her eyes away, hoping that he would catch her meaning and leave, but he grew curious and stared at her reflection instead. "You must know I'm here," he told her in a playful voice. She was not in the mood to talk to him. She kept her eyes turned away and her mouth shut. Her only response to him was to cross her arms. She was certain that doing this would get her point across, but Roy didn't budge. "Are you upset?" he asked her, in a tone that suggested that he genuinely didn't know. When she didn't answer, Roy walked around her, hoping to make her look at him. She turned away once again. "Listen, if you think that I didn't pay you enough for that sandwich, I apologize. Let me make it up to you." She was not going to play his game. Still, she ignored him. "Now," he started, trailing off because he didn't know what else to say. Finally, he continued by saying, "Now listen, I genuinely don't know what I did to upset you, but I'd like the opportunity to apologize from the bottom of my heart, if you'll just tell me." By this point, his act was growing old. She clenched her jaw as tightly as possible, hoping to keep herself from yelling at him right there in the street. Yet he kept pushing her. He kept speaking to her as though he had no idea what he had done, and the urge to slap him across the face was growing harder to resist by the moment. "Listen, doll, I'm sorry. I'm really, truly sorry. Can we be friends again now?" She uncrossed her arms, but resisted the urge to smack him. Instead, she turned toward him and gave him the coldest look that she could muster. "Friends?" she asked him. "Is that what we were?" "I thought so." "Tell me, do you treat all of your friends like this?" "Well, I usually don't have to apologize quite this much. I find that rather hard to believe. It's true, people like me. Until you stab them in the back." He seemed genuinely offended. He cocked his head and asked her, "I stabbed who in the what?" "You play nice with your fancy suits and your polished shoes getting girls to talk to you. Then you swoop in for the kill." "I never swoop." "You also never told me that you were a reporter coming to cover the Teddy Dowling story. You let me run on and on about my brother-in-law just so you would be able to exploit him in your rag of a newspaper. You mean I wrote the story as it actually happened? You wrote the story based on what I told you. Did you lie to me? I'm not the liar here." "Neither am I. Your brother-in-law was responsible for finding that boy, wasn't he?" "But the police never." "The police never. Exactly. So maybe the question isn't why I told the story. Maybe the question here is why they didn't." "Because he never wanted to be turned into a news story." "Then maybe he shouldn't put himself in the middle of the story when it's happening." Mary was fuming. She balled her fists and narrowed her eyes, but restrained herself. Instead of hitting him, she simply let out a huff. "You're a vulture, a real vulture," she told him when she could form words again. "Do you know what your story did to Joe? It turned him into a sideshow. You made him into a laughingstock. If you can show me one word of that story which isn't true, I'd be happy to print a retraction." Roy responded, somehow managing to sound calm and collected while she fumed. I never said that he was psychic, she shot back. Magical abilities is what you called them. A sixth sense. At one point, I believe that you even referred to him as the ninth wonder of the world, and I didn't have the heart to tell you just how little sense that made. She shrank back a little bit, feeling even more guilty than ever as she heard her own words repeated back to her. It was her fault, there was no denying, but he was still a despicable fink. You never told me that you were a reporter, she said. I thought I was just having lunch with what? With a poor soul who looked like he probably didn't have a friend in the world, she replied, lying right to his face about why she wanted to have lunch with him. He paused for a moment, studying her as though he could read her mind. She held his stare, never wavering. Have dinner with me, he said rather than asked. Now she stopped to study him. After a moment, she grinned and said, I really did want to have lunch with you the other day. I thought that you were handsome and charming. But then you took my words and used them against the only family that I have left in this world. Now I can barely stand to look at you. She wasn't lying that time, and he seemed to realize that fact because he took a step back. His playful attitude was gone. If you came here to speak with Joe, you're wasting your time. He's not going to give you another quote to hang on your wall of trophies, and neither am I. So I'll ask you kindly to leave us alone. Just go away, back to whatever rock you crawled out from under. Even as she said those words, Mary wondered if she was being too harsh on Roy. She wondered if she was taking the anger that she felt toward herself out on him. He took another step back, looking away from her as though to see if anyone was listening in on their conversation. When he looked back at her, he seemed genuinely hurt. Then, as he turned to walk away, Mary could have sworn that she saw the faintest hint of a smile move across his lips. The brief glimpse of that smile sent a chill through her entire body. Joe hadn't slept the night before. As he sat in the back room of the bookstore, he couldn't get the image of that missing woman out of his head. When he tried to close his eyes, she was there, frozen in the pose from her photograph. If it hadn't been for the date that she disappeared, maybe he would have been able to forget her, just like he'd put all of the other missing people out of his mind over the previous week. She was no different. There was nothing familiar or particularly special about her, yet he couldn't stop wondering why she had been brought into his life. Where did she fit into the bigger picture? He was out of the bookstore by 4 o'clock that morning, hoping that he could tire his body so that his mind would follow. Even when most of the world should have been asleep, the street had a good number of people making their way to or from jobs or wandering home from a bar, barely able to hold themselves up. Despite those people, there was a stillness to the pre-dawn morning hours. Before the light of day shone down upon the world, everything was shrouded in mystery. Many of the people who walked the street were too tired to think or feel anything beyond the need to get where they needed to be. Joe could feel that fatigue, but he didn't share it. Upon first walking out of the bookstore, Joe spotted a car on the other side of the street. The glow of a street lamp was reflecting off of its windows, blocking his view of the person behind the wheel of that car. He didn't know why he noticed it. Maybe it was because as soon as he walked onto the sidewalk, he felt suddenly on alert, as though something was about to happen. Nothing did. He walked away from the bookstore, leaving his own car behind and putting space between himself and that other car. He put it out of his mind entirely by the time he had turned right and walked a couple of blocks. His mind was too busy with other thoughts. As he moved, he walked through the night when Norma and Maggie died. Over and over again, he played out the thought of them walking down that street, never knowing why they would have been there in the first place. It was raining. They would have been tired and maybe a little nervous. Norma wasn't the type to go walking down the street in the middle of the night, especially with Maggie. His mind was creating a jumbled image. Half the time they died, just like in real life. The other half, he was there instead. When he'd run through that night, and there was nothing else to picture, the whole thing started over again. This had happened a lot over the previous couple of years. Whenever he was stressed or tired, or even when he was bored enough to let his mind freely wander, he was always back on that night with them. The more stressed he was, the more times he put himself through that misery. But now things were different. Now it wasn't just about his wife and his little girl. Now he wasn't just asking, why me, and feeling sorry for himself. Now he had the image of that other woman floating around in his head, the woman who had gone missing 1 year to the day after his wife and daughter died. As he walked those streets, Joe desperately wished that he could believe in coincidence. He wished that he could allow himself to shrug it off and get on with his life. But it wasn't that simple. Who was that Meyer girl? What was he supposed to do with the knowledge that she had disappeared on May 7th? He wished that he could imagine himself questioning witnesses and getting to the bottom of that girl's disappearance, but he wouldn't know where to begin. He was a postman turned sales clerk, not a detective. He reminded himself of that fact over and over, nearly as many times as he replayed the night when his family died. He felt helpless. He felt useless. He felt like there was some piece of the puzzle just beyond his reach, and it was driving him crazy. He turned left and continued walking. There was a bakery up ahead, causing the entire street to smell like fresh bread. It was an alluring smell, which would have had him buying a loaf if only the bakery was open. Instead, he had to settle for the smell. Joe allowed his eyes to linger on the bakery sign for a few moments. For that time, his mind seemed to clear. He had a singular thought, and even if it wasn't the deepest thought he'd ever had, it took his mind off of everything else. And then the moment passed. His eyes wandered from the bakery sign toward the street. There were cars parked all along the curb, but one caught his eye. He could have sworn that it was the same car that he had noticed earlier, sitting outside of the bookstore. He stopped walking and stared at the car, wondering how it could have gotten there. Did it pass him and park when he wasn't paying attention? The person sitting behind the wheel of that car was still a mystery to him. It was too dark and they were too far away for him to catch so much as a glimpse of that person, but he stared nonetheless. He felt as though they were watching him back. Several seconds passed as Joe looked through the windshield of that car, still feeling nothing from the person inside. For all he knew, they could have been seething with hatred, aiming a gun right at him. He didn't know how long he was willing to stand there watching that car. He never had the opportunity to find out either. Eventually, the engine started and the headlights came on. The car pulled away from the curb and down the street, without Joe ever seeing who was inside.
This is the voice of the Embers, where stories burn and fade.